Hey everyone, welcome back. This is day one of biopsych. As a reminder, biological psychology is when we are looking at how something physical, something tangible can impact how we think, feel, and act. And so a big part of this unit is going to be talking about our brain and our nervous system. We'll talk a little bit about our endocrine system and hormones. And we'll also talk a little bit about things that we can put in our body that might impact our different thoughts, feelings, and actions as well. Before we get into all of those things, before we get into the brain, we need to start at the beginning with the building blocks, and that is talking about neurons. So, this lecture is going to focus on these little tiny cells that we have in our nervous system called neurons. I'm going to use this piece of paper here to kind of draw a neuron for you. So, I encourage you to do the same, draw this very simplified version of a neuron in your notes, and we will talk about some of the different structures of the cell and what they do. So, today we will be focusing on neurons. What are neurons? Well, essentially, neurons are cells, right? Neurons are cells, but they're a specific type of cell. First of all, they are the cells that make up our nervous system, right? Our brain, our spinal cord, and the nerves that travel throughout our body. But they're also unique in what they do. Neurons are cells that will send and receive information. Neurons are cells that send and receive information. And you may think, well, what kind of information? To which I would reply, everything. Like everything we do is the result of neurons sending and receiving information. Every thought that you have when you problem solve, when you're thinking about the future, when you're remembering the past, your ability to do stuff, your ability to hold a pen, ride a bicycle, throw a softball, all of that is the result of neurons sending and receiving information. They are specialized cells that we find throughout our body, and we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. Hundreds of billions of them. You have 100 billion neurons in your brain alone. And so let's take a look at what a very simplified neuron looks like. So we're going to start by kind of drawing this weird starfish looking creature. And you can draw something maybe similar to that in your notes. And that is going to be our cell body. And we label the cell body soma. It's a good word to know for psychology. The word soma translates to body, and we'll talk about that a couple different times this year. For example, we'll talk about somatic symptoms or somatoform disorders and things like that, and they deal with the body. So just think soma equals body. And located in the middle of our cell is our nucleus. Now, you've probably learned about the nucleus since middle school science classes and bio classes. It's kind of the part of the cell that is in control, that is in charge. And so we have our nucleus there, and we're really not going to get into all the details about other cell components that you've likely learned in biology class, but know that those likely exist too. Let's look at some things that perhaps you haven't seen before. And so, one thing that makes neurons an interesting type of cell is this long arm that stretches out from the cell body. And you're going to see I'm drawing it kind of in this weird way here, but it will hopefully make sense in a minute. So I've drawn it with kind of these segmented lines, and you'll notice I'm going to do that because I'm going to go back and I'm going to fill in kind of this segmented fat that goes around the axon. It's this encasing that surrounds our axon. And that's not the best drawing, but I think you get the idea. So what we have here are two different structures that are both pretty important. The arm itself, right, the length of this arm is what we call an axon. And the axon is the part of the neuron that stretches away from the soma. You can think the A in axon, away from the soma, or the A in axon, you think the arm of the cell. And it is responsible for sending the information. So information is being sent down the axon. Information travels in this direction down the axon. That's important to know. And then surrounding our axon is this fatty substance, and it kind of has this whitish color. And it's what we call the myelin sheath. And the myelin sheath does a couple of things. First of all, it protects the axon. You might be familiar with a sheath for like a sword or a dagger and how it protects the weapon. Well, the same thing with the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath will protect the axon, but it also does something pretty cool that I'll talk about here in just a second. So let's go ahead and write myelin sheath. Right? Myelin sheath, and again, that's this segmented part that we see. So I said it protects the axon, but the other thing it does is it actually speeds up the message that's traveling down the arm of the axon. So this message is already going really fast. We're talking 100 miles an hour, right? Really, really quick considering it only has to go a fraction of an inch or so. But that myelin makes it go even faster. It speeds up the process of what we call neurotransmission. And as that message travels down our axon, when it gets to the end, I'm going to kind of move this over a little bit. When it gets to the end, it's going to release these chemicals into this space. And the space has a name, and that's called a synapse. So the space is a synapse, and released into a synapse are going to be all these little tiny chemicals. Those little tiny chemicals are called neurotransmitters, and we are going to have a whole lesson where we talk about neurotransmitters. So I'm going to label those dots neurotransmitters. Again, those are pointing to the dots that are in the synapse. Message travels down the axon, which is encased by the myelin sheath. When it gets to the end of the axon, it releases these chemicals into the synapse. Those are called neurotransmitters. And then waiting on the other side of the synapse is a neighboring cell. And it's going to get cut off here because I didn't plan ahead with my drawing. But over here is going to have a neighboring cell with these little finger-like structures that are meant to catch those. And I'm going to show you it's the same thing over here. So these finger-like structures that are branching out from the backside of the soma, we call those dendrites. And dendrites are responsible for receiving the information. So we have that the axon sends information. Well, the dendrites are going to be responsible to receive the information. And so this is just one single neuron, right? But you imagine as this electric message travels down the axon, releases chemicals in the synapse, it then goes to a neighboring neuron that is ready to receive that information. And so you can think of it, if we take this box up here and we zoom out a little bit, okay? Here are our neurons. We've got our nucleus in each one. They are surrounded, they have these axons that are perhaps surrounded with our myelin sheath. As the message travels down the axon, it will release neurotransmitters into the synapse. This next neuron will receive that message and it will continue on its way. All right, very simplified version of a neuron. What we want to do is we want to zoom in a little bit. We want to zoom in on this synapse. So let's take a new piece of paper here. I want you to draw something similar to that. If we zoom in, here's our initial piece of paper here. And if you just look right here in the synapse, okay, and you focus on this one little part, here is the end of an axon, and then here's the end of a dendrite. So that's going to be what this is, zoomed in. This right here is the end of an axon, and this is going to be the end of a dendrite. So you know which direction the message is going, right? The message is traveling in this direction. The end of our axon has a very specific name. The end of our axon is what we call a terminal or a terminal button. So we're just going to say this very, very tip of the axon is the terminal. And you can think just like an airport terminal where airplanes kind of take off, same thing with an axon terminal. At an axon terminal, it's where the information takes off. Well, what information? Located in the axon terminal are going to be these little bubbles. And the bubbles are called vesicles. And the vesicles contain or hold neurotransmitters. So let's go ahead and just put some fake neurotransmitters in here. I've got some green triangles in there. And some red circles. Now the color, the shape, the quantity, that's all just random, okay? Maybe a couple blue squares. And again, color, shape, quantity is random. So inside each of these vesicles, we have chemicals, we have neurotransmitters. And as the message travels down our axon, it's going to hit these vesicles and it's going to push those vesicles up against the terminal wall. And when those vesicles are pushed up against the terminal wall, then it's going to release those chemicals. And as a reminder, that space in between these two neurons, we call that space the synapse, right? So we're going to push those chemicals into our synapse. There go our red circles and our green triangles and our purple squares. Those chemicals are going to travel across the synapse, and what they're going to do is they're going to bind at the dendrite, specifically the ends of the dendrites, which we call receptors. So just like the end of an axon is called a terminal, the end of our dendrites are called receptors. And you'll notice quickly this pattern that we have. And again, this is simplified to kind of show you the idea here. But what you'll notice is that there's a very specific pattern for those dendrite receptors that's looking for those neurotransmitters. As the neurotransmitters cross the synapse, they are going to bind like a lock and key, a very specific combination. And when those neurotransmitters bind, what it does is it'll excite that next neuron, what we call the postsynaptic neuron, and it will cause that neuron here to send the message on its way. So this is a presynaptic neuron, presynapse, right? Presynaptic neuron sending the message down, hits the vesicles. Vesicles go against the terminal wall, releases neurotransmitters into the synapse, which bind with the postsynaptic neurons receptors and then sends the message on its way. So a few more terms to kind of figure out there. Now, let's say we have a couple of these neurotransmitters bind and then there's some left over, right? We've got some triangles and circles kind of hanging out in our synapse. Well, we don't necessarily want those to just hang out forever. And so our brain's pretty smart. And what we do with these extra neurotransmitters is we actually recycle them. And they go back up into the vesicles in a process called reuptake. And that becomes pretty important when we talk about how different drugs work, because they may impact the reuptake system and whether or not we're sucking up enough or too many of the neurotransmitters that are in our synapse. So, quite a few terms for you, two beautiful drawings that you hopefully now have in your notes. We're going to use that as the basis moving forward of kind of neurons and what neurotransmission looks like. As always, if you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to ask, and good luck.